The first thing Kale noticed when he stepped through the palace gate was the silence. Not the silence of an empty house. Something subtler. The silence of a place that had been loud for a very long time and had only just stopped, the particular hush of held breath, of a space that had been performing readiness in his absence and was now, in the gap between his arrival and the moment it learned he was here, simply resting. He stood in the archway of the inner courtyard and breathed it in. 8 years and it still smelled the same. The mineral bite of old stone, the char from the forge on the southern wing. Something floral from the kitchen gardens that he could never identify and had never asked about because it was one of those small mysteries he preferred to keep. A thing whose value lived precisely in remaining unnamed. His escort of 4 waited behind him at the outer gate. He had waved them off. He always waved them off when he came home. He needed the first moments of the palace to himself, to remember what he was fighting for before the councils and the generals and the petitions began again. His adjutant Sar had offered to come in with him, and Kale had looked at him, and Sar had remembered himself and stepped back. That had been fine. The campaign was over. He had signed the last documents 2 days ago in the field commander's tent, in the particular dry language of empire that made every monumental thing sound like an invoice. He had ridden hard since, in the private way, to be back before the scheduled return date. A thing he had not explained to anyone, because there was no explanation that did not require more honesty than he felt prepared to offer. He had returned early. What he had not expected to need was a reason for what he was seeing. Across the courtyard, kneeling in the dirt beside the great fountain, which had not run since his mother's time, which the court engineers had declared structurally dead, which 3 successive architects had quoted sums for repairing that Kale had quietly shelved, because the repair funds always found more urgent destinations, was a human. His human maid. She was wrist-deep in the fountain's base mechanism, her sleeves rolled past the elbow, her dark hair pulled back with what appeared to be a length of copper wire she had liberated from somewhere. Beside her on the flagstone sat a clay pot of something that smelled like vinegar, a chisel, 2 rocks of different sizes that she was apparently using as improvised mallets, and a small collection of parts that Kale did not recognize and could not identify, which meant they had come from the fountain itself. The fountain she was apparently rebuilding. She had not heard him approach. The stone of the courtyard was thick and she was focused, her whole body angled into the work, her tongue pressed to the corner of her lip in concentration. She tapped something twice with the smaller rock. Then she tilted her head and listened not for words but for what lives in the space between sounds, the way a physician listens to a chest. She tapped once more. Something inside the fountain made a sound Kale had not heard in 30 years. A low, waterlogged thunk of a mechanism seating into place. The deep satisfaction of a thing remembering what it was made to do. She exhaled through her nose. Satisfied. Then she became aware of him. She turned slowly, the way someone turns when they are hoping what they sense behind them is not what they suspect it is. Her eyes found him traveling up, because he was a great deal taller and she was still crouching. And by the time her gaze reached his face, she had already been performing the mental arithmetic of the situation, and arriving at conclusions she did not appear to enjoy. She scrambled upright, wiping her hands on her work apron, which had started its life as one of the formal aprons of palace service, and had been converted, somewhere in the past several months, into a garment primarily useful for holding tools and absorbing the evidence of labor, and executed a bow that was technically correct and slightly undermined by the grease on her forearms. "Your radiance," she said. "You were not expected until the 3rd moon of Sorrowing Month." "The campaign ended early," Kale said. He looked at the fountain. He looked at the parts on the flagstone. He looked at her. "What," he said, "are you doing?" Her name was Marin. She had come to the palace 11 months ago as part of the tribute delegation from the settled territories, the polite name for what had been, until 3 generations back, the contested border zones between the Dragon Empire and the old human kingdoms. The tribute system was old and mostly ceremonial now. A handful of humans sent each cycle to serve in the palace, to demonstrate the alliance held, to carry customs back and forth. Most served their term quietly, learned enough Draconic to navigate the kitchens and the formal chambers, went home with a stipend and a story to tell their families. Marin had spent her first week learning the palace's water system. Not because she was assigned to it. Because it was there, and it was broken, and apparently for her these two facts in combination constituted something close to a personal summons. She had arrived from the river settlement of Vascaro, which was built on a clay delta that flooded 4 times a year and demanded constant negotiation with hydraulics to remain standing. She had grown up watching her father recalculate drainage channels the way other children watched their parents cook. She had grown up with her hands in pipes, in the guts of flood barriers and channel gates, and the complicated ancient infrastructure that kept the delta settlements from simply washing away. She had come to the palace, seen the dried fountain in the central courtyard and the cracked heating conduits in the east wing and the soft spot in the kitchen courtyard wall, and apparently decided. Cale was piecing this together now from what the household steward Drayle was telling him, with increasing agitation in the great hall, that these things were her problem. She asked for the original construction diagrams on her second day, Drayle said. He was an older Drake, gray-scaled, meticulous, with the particular bearing of someone whose organizational pride had been simultaneously affronted and impressed, and was still working out how to reconcile them. I assumed she was curious. Humans often ask to see historical documents. I gave her access to the archive. And then she came back the following morning with a list of the materials the fountain repair would require, a proposed cost, a proposed timeline, and a note explaining that the secondary mineral deposits clogging the delivery shaft could be dissolved with a weak acid solution available in the kitchen stores, which would reduce the overall repair cost by approximately 40% and eliminate the need for specialist materials entirely. Drayle paused. She had done the cost comparison herself, with sources. What did you tell her? I told her the fountain was not her concern, that it was a matter for the court architects, that she had been assigned to household service, and that was where her attention should be. A pause. She said she understood completely. She thanked me for clarifying. She went back to her other duties. Cale waited. For 2 days, Drayle said. The full accounting took most of that first evening. Cale stood at the long table in the great hall and listened as Drayle walked him through it, methodically, with the documentation laid out in the order it had been created, because Drayle documented everything. The fountain was the current and most visible project. In 11 months, Marin had working in whatever hours she could assemble outside her assigned duties, which by Drayle's estimate she had extended considerably by sleeping less than anyone thought was sustainable, accomplished a quiet and thorough revolution in the palace's physical infrastructure. The heating conduits in the East Servants' Wing, cold since a pipe cracked in the winter storms 4 years ago, were repaired. She had found the crack on her 3rd week, identified the fix, and requisitioned materials from the household stores on a form that was technically within her authority as a service participant. When Drayle had questioned it, she had produced documentation showing that the cold was measurably affecting the productivity of the staff quartered there, and that the material cost was lower than the loss in service hours over a single winter. The math had been correct. The requisition had been approved. The drainage channel in the Undercroft, which had been causing slow water damage to the lower archive for at least a decade, creeping so gradually that it had simply become accepted as the nature of that space, had been rerouted. She had done this one over several nights, with a small team of junior staff she had apparently recruited by the simple method of explaining what the water was doing to the documents and waiting for someone to feel bad about it. The kitchen courtyard wall had taken longer. The structural fault ran deep, invisible to surface inspection, and she had spent 2 weeks persuading a stonecutter to look where she was pointing before she found one who believed what she was showing him. The repair had been completed 6 weeks ago. The wall was sound for another generation. Did anyone ask her to do any of this? Cale asked. No, Drayle said. Did anyone try to stop her? A pause. We tried with the heating conduits 3 times. She listened attentively each time. She explained what she was doing in terms that were extremely thorough. Then she continued. Another pause. The East Wing has been warm since autumn. The wash staff, who are also quartered there, gave her a small gift after the first cold night without the chill. They made it themselves, honey cakes. Cale was quiet. Outside, through the great hall's high windows, the palace courtyard was settling into evening. Somewhere out there, beside the fountain she had spent the last month taking apart and reassembling by hand, his human maid was eating her dinner, probably still thinking about hydraulics. Where is she now? He asked. Her quarters, Drayle said. I told her you would wish to speak with her. She asked if she should change out of the work clothes. I said yes. She asked if she should bring the fountain diagrams. He stopped. I said that seemed unlikely to be necessary. Tell her to bring them, Cale said. She came with the diagrams rolled under one arm, and her hair still faintly copper wire shaped from where she had been wearing it pinned. She had changed into the formal palace service dress, dark blue, silver thread at the cuffs catching the lamplight, the kind of garment designed to make the wearer look presentable to the emperor, which she wore with the bearing of someone who considers clothing primarily functional and is making her best effort. She stopped at the appropriate distance, executed the bow correctly, and waited. Cale looked at her for a moment. She was young, mid-20s by human reckoning, he estimated. There was something watchful about her expression that was not quite wariness and not quite calculation, but lived in the territory between them. A person who was always working out how things fit together, who could not look at a mechanism without mentally disassembling it. Whose attention, he suspected, was something you felt before you noticed it. The fountain, he said. How did you know it was repairable? She blinked, as though she had prepared for a different opening. The original construction used a compressed mineral delivery system, very sophisticated for its time, probably the most advanced hydraulic design in the empire in that period, based on what I found in the archive. Systems like that almost never fail structurally. When they stop working, it's almost always mineral buildup in the delivery shaft rather than collapse of the mechanism itself. She paused. Structural failure looks different. There are stress fracture patterns along specific load lines, spalling, a particular kind of secondary cracking. This one didn't have any of that. It just looked clogged. And if it had been structural, then I would have stopped when I opened the base casing and confirmed it, written a report on what I found and what the reconstruction cost would look like if you wanted to consider it. A slight pause. I have that report anyway, in case the comparison is useful. Of course you do, Cale said. He looked at the diagrams under her arm. Unroll them, show me where you are. She had marked the diagrams in 3 colors. Red for completed, blue for in progress, green for identified, plan not yet started. There was a great deal of green. She took him through it with the quiet precision of someone who has rehearsed the logic rather than the performance, not managing a presentation, just thinking clearly and saying what she thought. The northern water tower, the repair patch in the access shaft, was made of material chemically incompatible with the local stone. The differential thermal expansion was small but not zero, and over decades it was slowly working the patch loose. The repair is simple, she said. 2 workers, a day and a half, materials that cost less than a state dinner for 8. The eastern gate mechanism. The secondary pivot had a stress fracture buried inside the fitting, invisible to standard inspection. She had found it by listening to the gate's movement rhythm and noting a half-beat hesitation on the downswing that didn't match the resistance profile of a properly seated component. "Not urgent now," she said. "Urgent in about 3 years." She walked him through 6 more items on the green section, all documented, all with cost estimates, materials lists, proposed timelines. When she finished, she rolled the diagram back with the automatic care of someone who treats tools with respect, because tools are how things get done. "You've been here 11 months, Cale said. "You could have served your term and gone home without any of this." She was quiet for a moment, checking whether this was criticism or observation. Then, the east wing was cold, the archive was flooding. The wall had a fault that would have been dangerous eventually. A pause. "I can't see a broken thing and walk past it. I've tried, it doesn't work. Even when it isn't yours to fix." "The palace belongs to the Empire," she said. "The Alliance includes Vascaro. In some sense the things here belong to everyone in the Empire." She hesitated. "I can explain that differently if it sounds like overreach. I'm aware it could." "I understood it," Cale said. He looked at the diagram for a moment. "What have you learned about the people who built this place?" A small reorientation in her expression, the shift from operational to something more reflective. "That they planned for 10 generations out," she said. "The water system is significantly over-engineered for its current use. The capacity is at least double what the palace requires. The foundations are deeper than the load calculations for this structure's actual weight would demand. The heating conduit network follows a layout that doesn't make sense for the building as it exists, but makes excellent sense for a building approximately twice this size in a particular expansion pattern." She glanced up briefly. Whoever designed this expected the palace to grow. They built infrastructure for a future that was larger than their present. Cale was quiet. Outside, through the high window, the evening was deepening over the courtyard where the fountain would, in the morning, run for the first time in 30 years. "My great-grandmother built this palace," he said. "I know," Marin said. "I read her notes in the archive. She was exceptionally thorough." He had been at war for 8 years. Not continuously. There were the long winters when both sides dug in and survived rather than fought. Truces of necessity that built the strange intimacy you develop with an enemy when you have shared enough hard weather. But the campaign against the Veldron Reaches had been the defining fact of his reign. The northern clans were patient, methodical, 3 generations deep in their border pressure, and his predecessors had been managing them the way you manage a slow leak in a structure you have decided not to repair. Constantly, expensively, and without making any real progress. Cale had looked at the maps in the first month of his reign and understood that managing was not winning. That it was, in fact, a slow loss made bearable by the increments being small enough to call a stalemate. So he had gone north. 8 years of campaign seasons, taking ground that others had ceded and building fortifications that would hold across climates. His generals had sometimes doubted the patience required. He had not. He had learned patience from the problem itself. The Veldron did not hurry, and the way to outlast something that does not hurry is not speed but depth. You dig deeper. You build for longer. You do the careful work of designing for a future your present cannot fully see. He had returned to find a human maid doing exactly that to his fountain. He thought about this often in the days that followed. The strangeness of the parallel and the question it raised. What does it take for a person to walk into a foreign palace in service to a distant empire and look at the broken things and decide, without anyone asking, that they are yours to fix? He had spent 8 years trying to build that quality into his officer corps, the willingness to see and act without waiting to be told, to trust your own assessment and move on it. Half his campaign difficulties had come from the gap between what his people saw and what they did about it. The pause where they waited for authorization. The hesitation that cost ground. He had been fighting that hesitation for 8 years and had improved it only partially. Marin appeared not to have it at all. He began finding reasons to talk to her. The first reasons war administration as a surface. The Northern Water Tower, he called her to the strategy room to authorize the repair, and the conversation that started with the paperwork migrated, almost without permission, into 45 minutes on hydraulic compression mechanics and the structural behavior of old imperial building materials over decades. He realized, with the particular adjustment of encountering something unexpected, that he was learning things, not things from the archive. Things that existed in the gap between documented specifications and the practical reality of how those specifications behaved over time. Knowledge that only lives in the hands and eyes of someone who has been doing the work in the actual material world for years and has thought carefully about what they observe. She did not frame it as teaching. She was just thinking out loud, and he followed the thread, and when he was wrong about something she said so briefly and moved on without making it a moment. He found this clarifying in a way he had not anticipated. The conversations became less administrative. She had read broadly in his archive, in the methodical way of someone who considers a library, a system, to be fully mapped rather than a collection to be sampled. She had opinions that were specific, well-reasoned, and occasionally about things nobody in his court ever discussed, because those things were simply too settled, too old, too obviously part of how the world worked to invite examination. The original treaty language with the settled territories, she said one afternoon, spreading documents on the strategy table. She had a habit of claiming horizontal surfaces for whatever she was working on, and Cale had stopped objecting to it. This clause hasn't been updated since the signing, but the population distribution has shifted substantially. 3 settlement zones that were considered secondary when this was written are now among the primary economic contributors. The tribute structure doesn't reflect that. Cale looked at the clause. He had read it many times. What would updating it look like? She had a proposal, 3 options, with projected impacts for each. She walked him through them with the same quality of attention she brought to the water tower documentation, not arguing for an outcome, just mapping the territory and letting him navigate. He kept the documents. He sent them to his treaty council the following week. He noticed she was careful about certain things. The formal chambers, she moved through them with precision, observing protocol, maintaining the appropriate distances and registers of address. She had learned the hierarchy of the court the same way she had learned the palace's water system, systematically, until it was internalized. When she brought ideas, she framed them as information, as options. She was patient when things were tabled or modified. She did not push. She did not campaign for recognition. She just kept finding broken things and fixing them when no one was watching, and leaving the evidence of the repair behind as a simple fact. He asked her about it once directly. "You're careful not to seem ambitious," he said, "but you're not unambitious." She thought about this for a moment. "I'm not ambitious," she said, the double negative doing necessary work. "I have things I want to accomplish, but ambition that advertises itself is usually ambition that wants the position more than the work." A pause. "I want the work. And I'm a human in the Dragon Emperor's palace. I don't have the margin to make enemies carelessly. I try to be precise about which ones I make and why." "You've made some anyway," Cale said. "Coordinator Vel," she said, without visible surprise that he knew. "I didn't mean to embarrass him with the Undercroft documentation. I meant to document the Undercroft. The embarrassment was a consequence of the documentation being accurate." A pause. "I left him a note suggesting the overpricing in his approved estimate might have been an honest contractor error. It wasn't, but it gave him an interpretation that didn't require him to be defensive." She hesitated. "He didn't take it." "But I tried." "What do you do now?" "Document everything involving him very carefully. I've already made sure Drayle has copies in his own files." She looked out across the courtyard. "I'd rather it didn't come to that. A wall that gets repaired is real. A conflict that gets managed is just less bad than a conflict that doesn't. She paused. I'd rather build things. Kale looked at her. You think about people as systems, he said, the way you think about pipes. She seemed momentarily surprised by the framing, turned it over. I suppose I do, she said. Is that, I'm not sure if that's meant as a compliment. It's accurate, Kale said. Make of that what you will. Something in her expression shifted, a fraction of relaxation, so small he might have imagined it. But he was becoming practiced at reading her, the way you become practiced at reading any landscape you spend enough time in. The small tells. The way her eyes moved when she was working something out versus when she had already worked it out and was deciding what to say. The way she held herself differently in formal performance versus simply thinking. He was cataloging these without deciding to. The way he had cataloged the terrain of the northern reaches, not for any single purpose, but because understanding the ground was always useful, always, eventually, necessary. The reports from the north arrived on the 17th day after his return. He had known they were coming. Sar brought them in the evening, and Kale sent everyone out and read them alone at the long table with only the lamp for company. The Veldron chiefs had formally surrendered the contested territories. All 3 of the border fortifications were holding. The garrison assessments were positive. The supply lines were functioning as designed. The border was, for the first time in 3 generations, stable in a way that did not require constant active pressure to maintain. He had known all of this. He had been there, but reading it in the formal language of empire, the dry, considered language his great-grandmother had used for her own documents, that made every monumental thing sound like architecture. He felt the weight of it settle into him in a way it hadn't on the battlefield. 8 years. He sat with it for a long while. The lamp burned down. Outside, the palace had gone quiet, and the fountain, running now, had been running for 2 weeks. The soft, constant sound of water in the courtyard that he was still adjusting to, still catching himself listening for when he woke in the night, made its small, steady sound through the window. He heard a knock. Marin stood in the doorway with a covered tray. She looked at the reports on the table, at the lamp burning low, at him. She was performing a rapid and apparently thorough assessment of the situation, and he watched her arrive at her conclusions. Drayle sent me, she said. He was concerned you had forgotten to eat. He asked me to come because, a pause. He says I'm better at determining whether there's actually something wrong, as opposed to someone just being, another pause. His word. Dramatic, Kale said. His word is accurate. She set the tray down with automatic efficiency. Then instead of withdrawing, as she would have in the formal chambers, she looked at the reports for a moment. The campaign, she said, it's finished. Formally, he said, yes. She was quiet. The fountain ran. Then, 8 years is a long time to hold things on the home side. He looked at her. The household staff, she said. The palace. I've only been here 11 months and I can see it the way they talk about this place. The older staff especially. They talk about it the way people talk about something that belongs to them, not a property. Something they're responsible for, something they've been keeping. A pause. They've been keeping it for 8 years while you were away. I thought you should know that in case you would want to say so when you speak to the household. Not just the formal thanks. The specific thing that you saw what they held. She said it the way she said everything practical, as information clearly without pressure. Then she stepped back. Your dinner is getting cold, your radiance, she said. Then so quietly he might have almost imagined it. I'm glad you're home. He asked for her the next morning. Not for the water tower, not for a report. He sent Drayle with a message that said he would like her company for the morning review of the northern courtyard annexes. He watched from the high window as Drayle delivered it, watched Marin read it, watched the small controlled pause before she nodded. Drayle came back with her reply. She would be honored. She had also, as it happened, completed a survey of the northern annexes 3 months ago and had documentation if it would be useful. "Tell her to bring it," Cale said. They walked the northern courtyard in the early morning light, and she talked about the annexes with her characteristic precision. What she had found, what needed attention, what could wait, what was simply the interesting history of a building that had been added to by 7 successive generations without any of them having the original plans. He listened and asked questions and found himself, not for the first time, simply enjoying the way her mind moved. There is a quality to conversations with someone who is genuinely interested in what they are talking about, not performing interest, not managing a conversation, but actually thinking in real time about something that matters to them. He had not had many such conversations in 8 years of campaign. Strategy, assessment, diplomacy, protocol, useful, necessary, and almost never simply pleasurable. Around the second hour, the annexes receded, and they were talking about other things. An engineering solution he had observed among the Veldron for their cold-season fortifications that was genuinely clever in ways he had noted at the time with nobody to tell. A gap in the archive records from 3 generations back that she had a theory about. The small design details that reveal the character of the people who made them, what they valued, what they feared, what they were planning for that the present could not yet hold. He had been collecting things to tell her, he realized, without knowing that was what he was doing. Observations he had filed away during the campaign with no particular destination. They had apparently been waiting for this. The question of her departure came up on the 43rd day. Her term of tribute service was 11 months. She had been here 11 months and 3 weeks. The formal end of her obligation had passed while the fountain was unfinished, and she had asked Drail's permission to stay until it was done. And Drail, who had developed a quietly fierce proprietary investment in the outcome of all her projects, none of which Cale planned to mention to him, had agreed without consulting the calendar further. The fountain was finished. Cale looked at the official roster, at the departure date left blank, and then he set it down and walked to the courtyard. She was there. She was always there in some portion of the morning, not usually working, just sitting with a cup of something, watching the water. She used the fountain the way other people use a quiet room, a place to think before the day makes thinking difficult. She heard him coming this time. She looked up while he was still a few strides away, and he watched the brief moment where she was doing the calculation again, determining what this was, what it meant, before she started to rise. "Stay," he said. She settled back. He sat down on the fountain's edge across from her. The water ran between them, silver and quiet, and he listened to it for a moment. He had sat at this fountain as a child. He remembered now, in the years before it went dry. He had forgotten that he remembered it. "Your term is past," he said. "Yes," she said. "You could have gone home 3 weeks ago." The fountain wasn't finished. She looked at the water, and then it was, and she stopped. "I didn't go." He looked at her. She was not looking at him, deliberately so, her eyes on the water with an attention that was less watchfulness than the careful arrangement of not watching something. "There is a position," he said. She looked at him then. "It doesn't have a formal name. No one has needed it before. Imperial Structural Advisor, perhaps, though that's inadequate for what it would actually involve." He kept his voice even, informational, because that was the register she used for things that mattered. "You would be responsible for the physical systems of the palace and its dependencies, reviewing, planning, overseeing repair. You would have staff, a budget. The authority to requisition materials and labor without council approval for items below a set cost threshold." A pause. "It would require you to remain in the capital." She was very still. "It would require," he said more quietly, "that you stay." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. The fountain ran between them, 30 years of silence turned back into water by hands that could not see a broken thing and walk past it, by someone who had arrived in a foreign palace and decided, without being asked, that the things here belonged in some sense to her too. "The northern water tower," she said. "Still needs doing," he said. "And the eastern gate mechanism. I found a stress fracture in the secondary pivot last week. It'll need a specialist from Vascaro. The fitting pattern is our style. Whoever built it originally trained there, and the repair will require." "Marin," he said. She stopped. "Yes," she said very quietly, "I'll stay." The household address happened on the 6th morning. He had been thinking about what she said about the staff and what they had kept, and he had decided, in the quiet way he made most real decisions, to act on it. He gathered the household in the great courtyard at the second bell. All of them. The kitchen staff, the wash staff, the gate guards, the archivists, the junior drakes of the administrative wing, Drayle himself standing at the edge of the assembly with the expressionless expression of someone who is being careful not to have any expression at all. Cale stood at the top of the courtyard steps and looked at them. He had made speeches on campaign, battle addresses, formal declarations, the particular rhetoric of leadership under fire that was its own discipline and its own kind of truth. He had not, in 8 years, made a speech that was simply this: standing in front of people who had kept something in your absence and telling them you could see what they had done. He kept it short, specific. He named things: the archive, the east wing, the gate mechanism that was always getting stuck, and the guard who had been maintaining it by hand for 4 years. He named them the way she had suggested, not the formal thanks which was expected and appropriate and essentially ceremonial, but the specific recognition that said, "I noticed. I know what it cost. I know what it is to hold something when the person it belongs to is not there to hold it themselves." Afterward, walking back through the courtyard, he passed close to where Marin was standing with the kitchen staff at the edge of the assembly. She did not look at him directly, but he saw the small nod, barely a movement, more a settling, the particular quality of someone who had put something into motion and watched it land the way they had intended. He made a mental note, not for the first time, that she was very good at this. She was curious about the war. Not in the way people were usually curious, not for the battles, not for the commanders, not for the political machinery of the campaign. She was curious about the engineering. "The Veldron cold season fortifications you mentioned," she said one evening, when they had moved from the treaty amendments into what was becoming a comfortable habit of simply continuing to talk past the point where the official business ended. "You said the solution was clever. In what way?" So he explained it. The way the northern clans had solved the problem of ground movement in freeze-thaw cycles, the slow heave that destroyed conventional foundations over seasons and required constant repair and repositioning. They had designed their fortification footings to float rather than anchor, a system of interlocking stone sleds on a gravel bed, so the structure moved with the ground instead of fighting it. The maintenance cost, over a generation, was a fraction of the conventional approach. He watched her face while he described it, the particular focus that came over her when she was encountering a solution she had not seen before, not quite admiration, more the look of someone taking something apart in their mind to understand how it worked. "That's the same principle as the floodmat foundations in Vascaro," she said. "We use it for structures on the delta where the substrate is too soft to anchor. I didn't know the northern people had arrived at it independently." A pause. "Do you have documentation, diagrams, construction notes?" "There was an engineer with the surrender delegation," Cale said. "I could arrange for her to speak with you." Marin looked at him with the expression she had when she was working out whether something was being offered or simply suggested. "That would be very useful," she said carefully. "Then I'll arrange it," he said. "It seems reasonable that the Imperial Structural Advisor should have access to engineering solutions from across the Empire's full range." The small expression again, the adjustment, the beginning of belief in something she was still being careful about. Yes, she said, it does seem reasonable. The Veldron engineer's name was Avara, and she arrived 3 weeks later, a sharp-featured woman of middle age who had been skeptical of the invitation until Marin began asking questions, and then was not skeptical at all. They spent 4 days in the archive and the survey yard, and 2 long evenings in the kitchen where the light was best, drawing on large sheets of parchment, occasionally arguing in the complicated technical shorthand of people who have very specific disagreements about specific things. Cale passed through on the second evening and found them at the kitchen table surrounded by diagrams and the remains of someone's supper, and apparently in the middle of a heated and genuinely collegial debate about compressive load distribution in cold environments. He did not interrupt. He got himself a cup of something from the kitchen stores and stood in the doorway for a few minutes listening, and then went to bed. It occurred to him, sometime before sleep, that the palace had not sounded like this in 8 years, like a place where people were doing things that mattered. He had missed it. He had not known until now how much. There was a night, in the 7th week after his return, when he could not sleep. This was not unusual. Campaign habits persisted, the light sleeping, the waking at odd hours, the body's insistence on remaining alert when the mind had decided rest was appropriate. He had learned to work with it rather than against it, to use the dark hours for the quiet thinking that daylight made difficult. He walked, as he sometimes did, through the palace's inner courts. The fountain was running, the sound of it carrying through the stone corridors in a way that still caught him off guard sometimes, a small ghost of the past arriving in the present, the palace's memory of itself. He followed the sound without planning to. He ended up in the central courtyard in the dark, with the stars overhead and the water making its continuous soft argument with the stone. She was already there. She was sitting on the fountain's edge with her knees drawn up and her arms resting on them, looking at the water. She had a lamp, but it was turned low, barely more than a glow. She heard him and turned, and he watched the familiar sequence of assessment and adjustment before she started to rise. "Stay," he said, as he had before. She settled back. He sat down across from her, and they were quiet for a moment, just the water between them and the dark around them and the stars. "You walk at night," she said, not a question. "Campaign habit," he said. "I know, I've heard you sometimes." A pause. "I didn't want to say so in case it sounded like I was keeping track of you." "Were you?" "Not intentionally," she said, "but you get to know a building's patterns when you work in it long enough, who moves where and when. The night sounds." A pause. "You're usually in the eastern corridor." "And you're usually here," he said. She looked at the water. "I like listening to it run," she said simply. "I spent 6 weeks working on the mechanism. When it finally worked it felt—" She stopped, seeming to search for the right word. "It felt like something I'd been responsible for had come alive. I know that's not precise." "It's precise enough," Cale said. She looked at him. The lamp's low light was on her face, and she had that watchful, working things out look, but softer than usual, the way people look at 2 in the morning when the effort of careful presentation has simply worn through. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "You came home early," she said. "You could have stayed for the formal ceremonies. The surrender protocols, the garrison celebrations, that's weeks of precedent being set, and you left it to your generals. That's not," she paused. "Everyone says you never do that." Cale looked at the water. "I had been away for 8 years," he said. "The border is stable. The generals are capable. The precedents will be set correctly whether I am present or not." He paused. "I wanted to come home." She was quiet, considering this. "What did you want to come home to?" she asked. Then immediately, "I'm sorry, that's too personal." "It's not," he said. He looked at the fountain for a moment, at the water running in the dark. "I wanted to come home to this," he said, To the palace, to something that wasn't a campaign. He stopped. The honest answer lived just past the edge of what he was prepared to say in the 7th week. To the morning before the councils begin, he said. The first hour, when the place is quiet. She nodded slowly, as though she understood he had said something that meant something else entirely, and had decided not to press it. I like the morning too, she said, before anyone needs anything from you. They sat in the quiet for a while, with the water running between them and the stars overhead, and the palace holding its weight around them the way it had held it for 300 years. The comfortable, not uncomfortable silence of two people who have nothing they need to say, but are glad to be saying nothing in the same place. After a while, she said, the secondary filter on the north intake will need clearing in the spring. I'll add it to the seasonal list. Add it, he said. I already did, she said. I just thought you should know. He looked at her. She was looking at the water again, her expression calm and thoughtful, the woman who could not see a broken thing and walk past it, sitting beside the fountain she had fixed, in the palace she had been quietly keeping, in the empire that was, in some sense she had articulated once with complete seriousness, hers as much as anyone's. He thought about the green section of the diagram, about what it meant to keep making green sections, to keep finding things that needed doing and planning to do them, and having faith that there would be time. That was its own kind of hope, he thought, the practical kind, the kind that didn't announce itself. The council noticed, of course. They noticed the way councils always notice things, obliquely, with questions that were really statements, through the formal channels that existed precisely for delivering observations that could not be delivered directly. Councillor Aerith came to him on the 12th day with a request to review the new Imperial Structural Advisor position before it was formally recorded in the Imperial rolls. This was procedurally correct. It was also transparently something else. The position is unprecedented, Aerith said, in the careful tone he used when he was about to argue against something that was already decided. The authority to requisition labor and materials without council approval is below a cost threshold that I will set and that you will help me set, Kale said. The threshold will be reasonable. The oversight will remain in place for anything significant. The holder of the position is a human, Aerith said. She is, Kale said. She is also the person who identified and repaired every significant piece of failing infrastructure in this palace in 11 months without being asked, at a cost that I have reviewed and found to be approximately 1/10 of what the council's previous architecture estimates projected. He paused. If you have a concern about the quality of her work, I can provide documentation. Aerith was quiet for a moment. He was experienced enough to know when an argument was over. There will be questions, he said finally, from the other council members about the nature of the position, what it represents. Tell them it represents functional infrastructure, Kale said, and that the East Servants' Wing is warm for the first time in 4 years. I suspect the staff stationed there will agree that represents something worth having. Aerith withdrew. He did not raise the matter again. What Kale did not say to Aerith, because it was not Aerith's business. The council's discomfort was not really about the position. It was about what they had noticed in the past 43 days. The morning reviews that ran long. The evenings in the strategy room that had stopped being about strategy some time ago. The way the Emperor paused, sometimes, in the middle of a sentence, as though he was filing something away to tell someone later. The council was perceptive, in the way organizations that have been watching powerful people for a long time develop a kind of institutional perceptiveness. They saw what was happening. They simply did not yet have the language for it, because nothing quite like it had happened before. Kale did not give them the language. What happened between him and Marin was happening in the space that existed before language, in the accumulation of mornings and evenings and small observations, and the growing certainty that the most interesting mind he had encountered in 8 years of campaign was here, in his palace, cataloging its failures and planning for its future, and sitting with him in the dark beside the sound of running water. He had learned patience from the Veldron. From the problem itself, he could be patient now. She made a mistake in the 9th week. It was small, by the accounting of large things. A material requisition for the Northern Annex work that she had processed without flagging to Drail first, not because she had hidden it, but because it had fallen inside the threshold she had been given, and she had been moving quickly on a project that had a time-sensitive component, and she had not thought to pause. The requisition itself was completely correct. The materials were exactly right. The timing was necessary. What it had done was step through a purchasing relationship that Coordinator Vel had managed for 12 years, bypassing him without intending to, in a way that was procedurally permitted by the terms of her position, but which she had not thought through in terms of what it would look like. She came to him herself the same day, not when summoned, herself on her own account. "I made an error," she said. She was standing in the correct formal posture, but there was something different about it, not the careful management of a service participant, but the directness of someone choosing accountability. "The annex requisition. I processed it correctly by the terms of the position, but I moved through a purchasing relationship that has a history I didn't account for. It gave Vel a legitimate grievance, and I handed it to him, and I should have seen it coming." Cale looked at her. "What are you going to do about it?" he asked. "I've already sent him a formal written apology for the procedural discourtesy," she said. "Specific and without qualification. I'm not going to pretend the purchasing relationship was a better choice for the project, because it wasn't, and he'd know I was lying. But the discourtesy was real and the apology is sincere." A pause. "I've also updated my own protocols. Any requisition that touches a standing relationship even within threshold gets flagged to Drail first. It adds half a day to the timeline sometimes. That's the appropriate cost." He studied her for a moment. "That's a well-handled mistake," he said. "It was a preventable mistake," she said. "A well-handled preventable mistake is still a preventable mistake." She met his eyes directly. "I thought you should hear it from me before you heard it from anyone else." "I had already heard it from Vel," Cale said. A very small, controlled expression. "I assumed." He seemed to feel the apology was insufficient. "He would," she said, "but it's what the situation warranted and I gave it. What he does with it is his." She paused. "Is there a consequence you need to administer? I'd rather know directly." He looked at her for a long moment. The woman who could not see a broken thing and walk past it, and who apparently applied the same standard to her own errors that she applied to cracked water pipes and clogged delivery shafts. "No," he said, "you handled it." She nodded and turned to go. At the doorway she paused. "The annex materials arrived this morning," she said. "The work starts tomorrow." And then, in the same breath, with a directness that seemed to surprise even herself slightly, "Thank you for telling me about Vel directly. I know you could have just let it sit." "You came to me directly," he said. "It seemed appropriate to return the courtesy." She looked at him for a moment, then she left. He sat with that for a while, the small economy of it, the way two people build the grammar of how they treat each other, one exchange at a time, until it becomes the only grammar available. The northern water tower was repaired in the 3rd week of the following month. 2 workers, a day and a half. Materials cost 4% under her projection, which she documented with a marginal note explaining where the variance came from and what it indicated about her estimation model. The eastern gate took 2 weeks. The specialist she requested came up from Vas Caro. She knew him. Darrow, a craftsman who had trained alongside her father, a man of 60 with the particular weathered quality of someone who had spent his life doing careful work in difficult conditions. Cale came to watch on the 2nd day and the last. Both times she was deep in the mechanism, narrating in the shorthand she used when she was thinking out loud, and he stood at the edge of the workspace and listened and found he was following more than he had expected. When the gate swung on its pivot on the final morning, easy and true, so smooth that the 3 palace guards present exchanged startled looks, because they had grown up with the hesitation in it and never known it as absent, she stepped back and exhaled through her nose with that small sound. Then she turned to him. "It'll need checking at the start of each cold season," she said. "The thermal expansion can work the fittings loose over time if you're not monitoring it." "Add it to your calendar," he said. She looked at him. Something in her expression did a small thing, not surprise exactly, but the adjustment of someone who has begun, carefully, to believe something they had not been certain they were allowed to believe. Then she nodded and turned back to her notes, and he watched her write in the precise small hand she used for documentation, and he thought about 8 years. 8 years building something that had always been there waiting to be built, fighting the slow grind until the ground was no longer contested, doing the patient work of designing for a future the present could not fully see. He looked at her diagram spread on the survey table, red for done, blue for in progress, green for identified, planned, not yet started. There was still a great deal of green. He thought about his great-grandmother's notes, the over-engineered foundations, the heating conduits laid for a building twice the current size, the water system built for a palace that did not yet exist. What it means to build for a future larger than your present, to trust that the future will be worth building for. He thought about a woman arriving in a foreign palace with a clear eye and an inability to walk past broken things, and what it takes to look at all of that, all the cold corridors and dry fountains and clogged shafts, and decide, without anyone asking, that they are yours. The green section of the diagram was not a problem to be solved. It was a promise. He looked at it for a long time, then he looked at her. "What's next?" he asked. She was already turning a page. The official histories would record his reign as the one that stabilized the northern border. The campaign, the formal surrender, the treaty amendments she had helped him draft. The fortifications that held across 3 subsequent winters without significant incident. Kale, called the Steadfast in the annals, Emperor of the Dragon Reaches, Conqueror of the Veldron. The official histories would not record the fountain. They would not record an East servant's wing warm for the first time in 4 years, or a lower archive dry at last, or a kitchen wall standing sound when 3 stonecutters had missed the fault. They would not record a woman wrist-deep in a base mechanism on the morning an emperor came home early, looking up with grease on her arms and the particular expression of someone who has been caught doing something they cannot stop doing even when they probably should. They would not record the conversations in the northern courtyard, at the strategy table, in the long evenings over documents and proposals, and the slow, unremarkable accumulation of a way of talking to each other that no longer required careful management. They would not record 2 people on the fountain's edge long after the morning's business was done, the cup gone cold between them, the light moving across old stone, finding the shape of each other's thinking the way you find the shape of any terrain you have decided to know. Patiently, with attention, until you can feel where the next thought is going before it arrives. What the official histories never record is the small human work, the careful daily maintenance of things. The choice to see what needs doing and do it, without authorization, without guarantee, without any assurance that the effort will be recognized or wanted, simply because you cannot look at a broken thing and walk past it. The things that hold. The fountain ran in the central courtyard as it had run in his great-grandmother's time, fed by mechanisms rebuilt by hands trained in the river settlements of Vascarro, now documented in the files of the Imperial Structural Advisor's office, with a notation that the primary delivery shaft should be cleared every 7 years, and the secondary filtration checked at each season's turn. The The green section of the diagram became blue, and then red. New green appeared. It always appeared. That was the nature of a palace built for a future larger than its present. There was always more future arriving than the present could hold. Always more to identify and plan and attend to. Always more careful work to do in the patient accumulation of a place that intended to last. She understood this. She had understood it from the first week. He was beginning to. In the courtyard, the old stones held their weight the way they had always held it, built deep by hands that planned for 10 generations out, that poured the depth of foundations they would not live to see the purpose of. The water ran. The morning light came over the palace wall the way it had come for 300 years, catching the stone in the particular gold of the capital's early hours. It caught the copper in her hair where she had pinned it back with wire again. She was bent over the survey table in the courtyard. A new set of documents opened before her, a fresh column of green in the margin, already planning for what came next. The fountain ran. The palace held. The future arrived larger than the present, as futures do, and there was room for it. There had always been room for it. They had built it that way.